Ondrej Trigo was a Slovak serial killer and necrophile who targeted women in Bratislava, Munich, and Amsterdam from 1990 to 1992. He served a life sentence until his death for 9 murders and 1 attempted murder in Leopoldov prison in Slovakia. Before committing his first murder, Trigo had already been convicted of crimes 11 times. He was a criminal from an early age, focusing mainly on home burglaries. Trigo was diagnosed with a schizoid personality disorder and an antisocial personality disorder, as well as necrophilia, finding pleasure in having intercourse with women with mutilated heads. Trigo remains the Slovak murderer with the highest number of victims, and he is also the most prolific serial killer in modern Slovak history. Vinko Pinteric was a Croatian serial killer and outlaw, who murdered 5 people over the course of 17 years and escaped from prisons and police stakeouts on multiple occasions. His violent, vindictive nature and proficiency with firearms struck fear into inhabitants of Hrvatsko Zagorje, a region of northern Croatia where he spent years at large, hiding from law enforcement and engaging in various crimes, until his 1991 death in a shootout with the police. Protracted media coverage of his exploits made Pinteric a household name in Croatia and Yugoslavia and even brought him a degree of sympathy from the general public, who saw him as a Robin Hood-like figure, and dubbed him Krug of Zagorje. He was killed with a single gunshot to the head. Pinteric is buried in the Lepoglava cemetery, in an unmarked grave. Boone Helm was an American serial killer, a mountain man, and gunfighter of the American West, known as the Kentucky Cannibal. During his crimes as a serial killer, he was known to commit acts of cannibalism and murder his victims. In 1850, Helm stabbed his cousin after asking him to accompany Helm to California. On the way, he murdered several men in various altercations, eventually committing premeditated murder. In 1862, after heavy drinking, Helm gunned down an unarmed man. Helm was active for 15 years between 1850 to 1864. He was known to have killed 11 men. Helm was apprehended in Montana. The Montana vigilantes hanged Helm in Virginia City, Montana, on January 14, 1864. Tanya Ford, a Taylor County woman, convicted of killing her police officer husband, was sentenced to 20 years in prison in the case. Police say Tanya Ford shot and killed her husband, Lebanon police officer David Ford, back in 2009. When calling 911, Ford said her husband had been shot, but also said she didn't go close to his body. After seeing him on the floor in a pool of blood, police say he was shot in the back of the head. A co-worker of Ford said he heard her say she would kill Officer Ford if she thought she could get away with it, and feel no remorse. She was convicted in the death. Ford was found guilty of first-degree murder, and the jury recommended a sentence of 20 years with the possibility of parole after serving 17 years. David Ford's family say they are not shocked and the couple had a rocky marriage. Huang Yang was a Chinese serial killer, accused of luring and murdering 17 teenage boys. Although he is suspected of 25 murders between September 2001 and 2003. In September 2001, Huang started to lure young people, mostly from rural areas, video halls, internet cafes, and video game rooms, to his house, by offering to recommend them for well-paid jobs, or to fund their schooling. He said he killed them because he wanted to feel the thrill of being an assassin. In his house, Yang drugged the youths and raped them after strangling them with a rope. He buried them, but kept their belts as souvenirs. Yang was sentenced to death on December 9, 2003 and executed by a gunshot to the head on December 26, 2003. Ian K., is a convicted murderer, known as the Woolworths Killer, and notable for committing an attack which cost the infamous serial killer Peter Sutcliffe the use of one eye. Kay was sentenced, in 1995, for a minimum term of 22 years imprisonment for the murder of 21-year-old John Penfold, a Woolworths shop assistant stabbed to death in Teddington, Middlesex in November 1994. Kay was on leave from prison, almost 8 years after nearly killing another shop worker in a similar attack when he killed Penfold. On trial, on January 28, 1998, Kay attempted to kill serial killer Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, stabbing him 6 times in the left eye and 4 times in the right eye with the Parker rollerball pen. Kay was sentenced to be detained in a secure mental hospital indefinitely. The incident began as a domestic dispute on March 29, 2001, in San Antonio, Texas, between Frank Martinez Garcia and his 21-year-old wife. Officer Hector Garza, 48, arrived at the house. He went inside and entered the bedroom where the couple was arguing. When he attempted to separate them, Garcia, who had his back to Garza, suddenly spun around and shot him in the head with a MAC-10 semi-automatic handgun. He then shot Jessica 6 times, killing her. The couple's 5-year-old daughter witnessed both murders. Garcia also shot and wounded the uncle of his wife during the incident. Frank Martinez Garcia was sentenced to death on June 10, 2002, and executed by lethal injection in Texas on October 27, 2011. Alan Lee Davis was convicted of murdering Nancy Weiler, a Westinghouse executive's wife, in Jacksonville, who was 3 months pregnant when she was killed in 1982. Mrs. Weiler was beaten almost beyond recognition, hit over 25 times in the face and head with a gun. Her 9-year-old daughter Christina was tied up and shot twice in the face. Her 5-year-old daughter Catherine was shot as she was trying to run away, and then her skull was beaten in with the gun. He was executed by electrocution in Florida on July 8, 1999. The Davis execution drew attention, after he had a nosebleed in the electric chair. Davis was on parole for armed robbery at the time of the murders. His weight of 350 pounds may have contributed to the execution problems. Salvatore Garoni, 67, of Staten Island, was convicted in the state Supreme Court in Brooklyn of 3 counts of second-degree murder. The series of shootings began on July 6, 2012, when Mohammed Gabelli, 65, was found inside his clothing store in the Bay Ridge neighborhood with a single gunshot wound to the neck. On August 2nd, Isaac Cadaret, 59, was shot in the head and his throat was slit inside his store in Bensonhurst. And on November 16th, Ramatola Vahidapur, 78, was shot in the head, face and chest in his clothing shop in the Prospect Lefferts Gardens neighborhood. The shootings were connected by 22 caliber shell casings recovered at the scenes. He was sentenced to 75 years to life in prison on March 4, 2016. Cynthia Gallons, a Farmington, Ontario County woman, was convicted of manslaughter after spiking her boyfriend's margarita mix with antifreeze. Gallons showed no emotion when Ontario County Court Judge William Coker handed down the sentence. Gallons was convicted of first-degree manslaughter for the death of Thomas Stack. Stack died in October 2009, after consuming margaritas that were made with the spiked mix. Gallons admitted in court that she put antifreeze in the margarita mix, knowing Stack would drink it. She said her intent was not to kill Stack, but to make him sick because he was physically and verbally abusing her. Mr. Stack consumed between 6 to 12 ounces of ethylene glycol, the toxic substance in antifreeze, before he died. She was sentenced to 23 years in prison on November 10, 2010. Stuart Campbell, was a builder who was convicted in December 2002 for the kidnap and murder of his niece, Danielle Jones, 15, and lost an appeal on January 21, 2005. She disappeared on June 18, 2001, while walking to a bus stop in East Tilbury, Essex, where she lived. Her body has never been recovered, and Campbell has always maintained his innocence. It is unusual to prosecute for murder in the UK without a body, but police found a pair of blood-stained stockings in his home, the DNA of which matched both Campbell and Danielle. This evidence was enough to convince the police that Danielle Jones was dead, and that Stuart Campbell was responsible for her death. He was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum 20 years, on December 19, 2002. Jacques Paul Freeman is an Australian convicted of murder in Bulgaria. In December 2007, Paul Freeman was involved in an incident during which Bulgarian student Andrei Manov was fatally stabbed. Paul Freeman attacked two male Bulgarian students and stabbed them, killing Manov instantly. The other man was saved in hospital. In his defense, Paul Freeman claims that he went to protect two Roma men from a group of thugs and they turned on him. His plea of not guilty based on self-defense was defeated, partially due to Manov having been stabbed in the back. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison on December 2, 2009. On September 19, 2019, Paul Freeman was unexpectedly granted parole, and in April 2021, Paul Freeman confirmed he had left Bulgaria but did not wish to disclose his location due to safety concerns. On April 9, 2011, 6 people were killed by a gunman who entered the Ridderhof Mall in Alphen aan den Rijn, Netherlands, a town approximately 33 kilometers southwest of Amsterdam. Tristan vandervilles, wearing a bulletproof vest and armed with a semi-automatic Smith & Wesson M&P 1522, a pistol, and a revolver, first got out of his black Mercedes-Benz and shot a person outside, then entered the Ridderhof Mall and fired more than 100 rounds, killing 5 people and injuring another 17, before he took a pistol, put it to his head, and took his own life. According to the police, he had an obsession with guns since his childhood. He was a member of a shooting association and possessed 3 firearms. Sophie Cenas was a German serial killer who is believed to have been responsible for poisoning her husband, aunt, and lover, and of attempting to poison her servant. Her trial led to a method of identifying arsenic poisoning. She poisoned a young Dutch officer named Raga, who was her lover, her husband Theodora Cenas, and her aunt, Christina Witt. At the end of February 1803, Sophie Cenas' servant, Benjamin Klein, became ill. She gave him an emetic, then soup, which made him worse. She gave him some plums. He secretly had them examined by a chemist, who confirmed that they contained arsenic. She was sentenced to life imprisonment on September 12, 1803, pardoned in 1833, and died on April 4, 1836. Mark Sappington is an American spree killer and cannibal who murdered 4 people in March and April 2001 in Kansas City, Kansas. He ate part of the leg of one of his victims. He had a history of schizophrenia and used the drug PCP. He claimed that voices in his head told him to eat flesh and blood or he would die. Sappington was convicted on June 23, 2004. He was sentenced to consecutive sentences of 3 life terms for 3 first-degree murders, 79 months for kidnapping, and 32 months for aggravated burglary in July 2004. Sentenced to life imprisonment without parole eligibility for 20 years for first-degree felony murder, plus a consecutive term of 130 months imprisonment for attempted aggravated robbery, in September 2004. Javed Iqbal was a Pakistani serial killer who was found guilty of the sexual abuse and murder of 100 children. In December 1999, Iqbal sent a letter to police and a local Lahore newspaper confessing to the murders of 100 boys, all aged between 6 and 16. In the letter, he claimed to have strangled and dismembered the victims, mostly runaways and orphans living on the streets of Lahore, and disposed of their bodies using vats of hydrochloric acid. He then dumped the remains in a local river. Iqbal turned himself in at the offices of the Urdu-language newspaper Daily Jang on the December 30, 1999. He was subsequently arrested, sentenced to death on March 16, 2000, apparently committed suicide by hanging himself in his cell with bed sheets on October 8, 2001. Eddie Linsky, the Singing Strangler, was an American soldier and serial killer. Linsky confessed to the strangulation and murder of 3 women in Melbourne, Australia. His self-confessed motive for the killings was a twisted fascination with female voices, especially when they were singing, and his claim that he killed the women to get their voices. Accordingly, the psychologist ruled that Linsky's crimes were born of his resentment and hatred of his mother, and thus constituted symbolic matricide. He was picked from a lineup of American servicemen. His trial was conducted under American military law. Linsky confessed to 3 murders, and was sentenced to death. In 1942, Eddie Linsky was executed by hanging at Her Majesty's Prison Pentridge in Coburg, Victoria, Australia. Sergey Golovkin was a Soviet-Russian serial killer known as the Fisher. When Golovkin was 13 years old, he began to exhibit sadistic tendencies, including catching a cat in the street and bringing it home, where he hanged it and then decapitated it. Golovkin tortured, raped and killed at least 11 young boys in his garage basement and the forests outside Moscow. Between 1986 and 1992, Golovkin would rape and sodomize the boys while cutting their genitals, torso, and throats. He was sentenced to death and was the last person executed in Russia before the death penalty was abolished in 1996. On August 2, 1996, Sergey Golovkin was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head in Moscow, Russia. Patrick McCullough was an American serial killer. He was born deaf on January 20, 1960 in Anchorage, Alaska. He was active for 22 years between 1980 and 2001, and known to have 3 confirmed victims. He confessed during the trial for the murder of Clint Riley. He also confessed to a friend and his girlfriend for the 2 murders of Clint Riley and John Meyer. He had an IQ of 120. In 1980, Patrick McCullough started his killing spree. During his crimes as a serial killer, he was known to rob, stalk, and murder his victims. Patrick McCullough was in possession of a firearm during his crimes. He was known to kill at the home of the victim. He died on November 30, 2001, at age 41, from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Daisy DeMelker was a South African serial killer and poisoner who poisoned 2 husbands with strychnine for their life insurance while living in Germiston. Melker also poisoned her only son with arsenic. On April 15, 1932, the police obtained a court order permitting them to exhume the bodies of Rhodes Cowell, Robert Sproat, and William Cowell. A week later, the police arrested Melker and charged her with the murder of all 3 men. DeMelker was accused of 3 murders but only convicted of 1, the killing of her son. The charges of poisoning her husbands were never proven in a court of law. Melker was executed by hanging on December 30, 1932 at Pretoria Central Prison, Pretoria, Gauteng, South Africa. DeMelker is the 2nd woman to have been hanged in South African criminal history. Leslie Warren is an American serial killer, known as the Babyface Killer. He was known to torture, strangle, rape, and murder his victims. Warren was the oldest of 2 siblings. He also had a half-sister and half-brother. Leslie Eugene Warren murdered 4 women in 3 different states before finally being apprehended in July 1990. He had been physically and psychologically abused since birth by his father. Warren received a sentence of death for killing Velma Gray and the Asheville murders of Jamie Hurley and Katherine Johnson. Investigators believe that he is responsible for at least 8 to 10 other murders, all women. He was arrested on July 21, 1990, convicted on September 15, 1993, and sentenced to death by lethal injection at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, U.S. Brian James Dugan is a convicted rapist and serial killer. He was active between 1983 and 1985 in Chicago's western suburbs. Brian showed classic symptoms of being psychotic from an early age. Dugan claimed to have been sexually abused by John Wayne Gacy at the age of 15. He was known for having informally confessed in 1985 to the February 1983 abduction, rape, and murder of 10-year-old Janine Nicarico of Naperville, Illinois, which was a highly publicized case. He was already in custody for 2 other rapes and murders. One of a woman in July 1984, and the other of an 8-year-old girl in May 1985. He was sentenced to life in prison for the first 2 murders, and death, commuted to life imprisonment, for the 3rd murder. David Edwin Mason was an American serial killer, who killed at least 4 elderly people between March and December 1980, in Oakland, California, and his cellmate in 1982 and possibly his male lover. During his crimes as a serial killer, he was known to rob, strangle, and murder his victims. For these crimes, he was sentenced to death, and executed at San Quentin State Prison's gas chamber in 1993, the last inmate to have been executed in this manner in the state. He was also the first condemned inmate since the reinstatement of the death penalty to voluntarily withdraw all of his appeals. David Mason was executed on August 24, 1993, age 36. He was buried in Mountain Shadow Cemetery in Sonora, California. Henry Louis Wallace is an American serial killer and rapist, known as the Taco Bell Strangler. Wallace confessed to the murders of 10 women in Charlotte, North Carolina. He would rape, strangle, or stab his victims prior to murdering them. During his time in the Navy, Wallace began using several drugs, including crack cocaine. In Washington, he was served warrants for several burglaries in and around the Seattle metro area. Wallace was a supervisor at Taco Bell. Some of his victims were his employees at Taco Bell in Charlotte, North Carolina. In 1997, Wallace was convicted on 9 counts of murder, and was sentenced to 9 death sentences. Henry Louis Wallace is awaiting execution at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. Stephen Richards was an American serial killer, also known in the media as the Nebraska Fiend, the Kearney County Murderer, and the Ohio Monster, who confessed to committing 9 murders in Nebraska and Iowa between 1876 and 1878. Richards was convicted for the axe murder of the Harlson family, a woman and her 3 children, and for the murder of a neighbor of his. Richards claimed to have committed his first murder sometime in late 1876. Most accounts state that on December 20, 1878, after his arrest, Richards was jailed in Steubenville, Ohio. Stephen Richards died on April 26, 1879, age 23, sentenced to death, executed by hanging, at a prison in Minden, Nebraska, U.S. Hiroshima. was a Japanese serial killer, known as the suicide website murderer. Maio found his victims in an online suicide community. He murdered 3 people. He was convicted of killing a 14-year-old boy, a 25-year-old woman, and a 21-year-old man, all of whom were members of an online suicide club. He lured his victims by suggesting they meet and end their lives together by committing suicide via carbon monoxide poisoning using a charcoal burner in a sealed car, but once together he strangled them with his bare hands instead, as this excited him sexually. Maio suffered from a psychosexual disorder, which made him unable to achieve sexual release in the absence of performing an act of strangulation. Hiroshi Maio was hanged on July 28, 2009. Silvo Plud was a Slovenian serial killer. After serving 13 years in prison in Slovenia for a rape and murder, Plud murdered a second woman in Serbia in 2004, and fled back to Slovenia, where a Serbian petition of extradition was turned down by the government. He was then arrested for attacking a couple. The wife died, the husband survived. Plud's cousin, Bohan Plud, was also a serial killer. On October 2, 2006, a Slovenia court sentenced Plud to 30 years in prison. On April 26, 2007, a court in Serbia sentenced him in absentia to 40 years in prison. In 2007, Silvo Plud committed suicide by overdosing on sleeping pills in his Ljubljana prison cell. Very Idham Hanyansaya, also known as Ryan, is an Indonesian convicted serial killer. Hanyansaya confessed to killing 11 people, and was sentenced to death by the Indonesian Criminal Court, after being arrested in 2008. The Hanyansaya case achieved notoriety throughout Indonesia, due to the gruesome nature of the murders. Known for his uncontrollable temper, Ryan bashed the heads of a mother and her child to death with a metal bar, after they made him angry. The body of one of the victims was found on a roadside in Jakarta, cut up into 7 pieces, and was skewered with a crowbar. Hanyansaya buried his other victims' bodies in the backyard of his home, in Jombang Regency in East Java. He is currently awaiting execution, at Kesambi Penitentiary in Cirebon. Felipe Espinoza was a Mexican-American serial killer, who along with his father and later nephew killed an estimated 32 people in the Colorado Territory. Espinoza is considered to be one of America's first serial killers, and Mexico's first serial killer, even though Francisco Guerrero Perez was the first Mexican serial killer to be captured in Mexico. Espinoza declared war on the United States, and wanted to kill as many Anglos as he could. There is no definitive reason as to why the Espinoza brothers began their rampage. He mutilated some victims' corpses with the heart hacked out of the chest. Espinoza was shot by a posse led by Tom Tobin, a legendary tracker of the times. Tobin beheaded the Espinozas and his nephew. His brother was killed in a previous gunfight with the posse. Deborah Brown is an American serial killer. Brown is borderline intellectually disabled, as well as diagnosed with dependent personality disorder. In 1984, at age 21, Deborah Brown became involved in an enslaved woman connection with the serial rapist and killer, Alton Coleman. For 2 months, during the summer of 1984, the couple left victims across several Midwestern states, including Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio. Prior to meeting Alton Coleman, Brown showed no violent tendencies and had no history of being in trouble with the law. She is serving her sentence at the Dayton Correctional Institution in Dayton, Ohio. In 2018, Indiana Attorney General's office signed an agreement withdrawing a demand for Deborah Brown's execution. Alton Coleman was an American serial killer, who, along with accomplice Deborah Brown, committed a crime spree across 6 states between May and July 1984 that resulted in the deaths of 8 people. During his crimes as a serial killer, he was known to rob, torture, strangle, stalk, rape, mutilate, and murder his victims. Coleman was already awaiting trial on a charge of rape when he began his killing spree. Coleman was arrested 3 days after he made the FBI's 10 most wanted list in 1984. Coleman, who received death sentences in 3 states, was executed by the state of Ohio in 2002. On April 26, Alton Coleman was executed by lethal injection in the death chamber at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. Kiyotaka Katsuda was a Japanese firefighter and serial killer. Known as Metropolitan Designated Case 113. Katsuda shot his victims using a gun he had stolen from a police officer after running him over with his car. He was known to have strangled at least one of his victims. Katsuda eluded capture for another 2 months and was arrested on January 31, 1983. He received 2 separate death sentences for the murders between 1972 and 1982. He was suspected of killing 22 people, but the police accused him of 8 murders. Kiyotaka Katsuda was executed by hanging on November 30, 2000. This was nearly 17 years after his arrest. Erwin Hagedorn was a German serial killer and sex offender. Hagedorn killed 3 boys ages 9 to 12 in a forest in Eberswald, Germany. In 1969, Hagedorn killed 2 9-year-old boys. During his crimes as a serial killer, he was known to stalk, rape, mutilate, and murder his victims. The Ministry for State Security matched the case of West German child murderer, Jürgen Bartsch, while assembling a psychological offender profile. The investigation was unsuccessful. In 1971, Hagedorn stabbed an 11-year-old boy, dismembered him, and tried to hide the body. Hagedorn was convicted and sentenced to death. Erwin Hagedorn was executed by a single gunshot to the head in 1972. Antonis Dagley was a Greek serial killer, known as the Athens Ripper. Dagley was a serial rapist with a predisposition for violence, upgraded to raping, strangling, and dismembering 3 prostitutes with a hacksaw in 1992, and tried to kill 6 more women. Dagley, a truck driver who preyed on Athens prostitutes between 1992 and 1995, subsequently confessed to the previously unsolved murder of a prostitute whose dismembered body was found in a dumpster in 1992. In his trial, he claimed to hate all prostitutes because his mother had been one. He was convicted and sentenced to 13 terms of life imprisonment, plus 25 years. In 1997, Antonis Dagley committed suicide in prison along with his cellmate in an apparent suicide pact. Leroy Martin was an American serial killer, known as the Gaffney Strangler. Martin killed 2 women and 2 young girls in South Carolina in 1967 and 1968. Martin raped and strangled his victims. Multiple victims had cigarette burns, and at least 1 victim was stabbed to death. When the killings began in 1967, Martin was employed at a textile mill in Cherokee County. He was married and had 3 children. Martin himself said he had a split personality, including a violent side that took control of him. He was convicted on 4 charges of first-degree murder, and received 4 life terms. Leroy Martin was stabbed to death by fellow inmate Kenneth Rumsey while incarcerated at Central Correctional Institution in Columbia in 1972. Katerina Pantila, the Angel of Death, was a nurse. She was convicted for the murder of a 79-year-old bedridden woman by injecting her with insulin at a rehabilitation center in March 2007. She was also found guilty of trying to kill a healthy, 8-month-old baby boy, the son of a relative, with a potentially lethal dose of insulin, at a family gathering, only days before the murder. The fact that a defenseless child was involved was taken as an aggravating circumstance. She was apprehended, put on trial, and convicted of the murder of the patient, and the attempted murder of the baby. She was sentenced to life in prison, on May 19, 2009. She committed suicide in prison, on March 8, 2010. Natasha Bates was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of her 2 boys, Leland, 5, and River, 3, who died of extreme overheating. Their body temperatures reached at least 109 and 103 degrees, inside a hot car in June 2012. An autopsy later revealed the children had no food in their stomachs. Though Bates repeatedly insisted on the stand that she discovered them lifeless in the yard, after leaving them unsupervised for a short time. During the trial, prosecutors showed evidence of meth making at the family's trash-strewn home. Bates was also found guilty of aggravated child neglect and of facilitating the manufacture of meth, convictions that amounted to a 40-year prison sentence, that will run concurrently with her 2 life sentences. On the night of August 6, 1982, Raymond Landry confronted the Pritis family in the parking lot outside a Dairy Maid store, run by the family. Pointing a gun at Cosmas Pritis, the husband and father, Landry ordered the family to turn over their money, including the money left in the store. In the course of the robbery, Landry shot Pritis in the head and killed him. The state of Texas convicted Landry of capital murder, and sentenced him to death. Landry's arms were so muscular and the veins so scarred from years of drug abuse, that the needle popped out as he lay on the gurney, spurting the lethal drug cocktail toward witnesses, and delaying the execution for 14 minutes, as prison staffers reinserted the catheter into the vein. Witnesses reported hearing at least one groan. Ruth Ellis was a British nightclub hostess and convicted murderer, who became the last woman to be hanged in the United Kingdom, following the fatal shooting of her lover, David Blakely. In her teens, Ellis had entered the world of nightclub hostessing, which led to a chaotic life that included various relationships with men. One of these men was David Blakely, a racing driver engaged to another woman. On Easter Sunday, April 10, 1955, Ellis shot Blakely dead outside the Magdala Public House in Hampstead, London, and she was immediately arrested by an off-duty policeman. At her trial in June 1955, she was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to death. On July 13, she was hanged at HMP Holloway. Robert Berdella was an American serial killer known as the Collector. Berdella abducted, tortured, and murdered at least 6 men between 1984 and 1987. He would hold victims captive for periods of up to 6 weeks. Berdella dissected his victims' bodies and disposed of the body parts in garbage bags. His last victim escaped and alerted the police. Berdella was found guilty of 6 murders in 1988, describing his murders as being some of my darkest fantasies becoming my reality. Berdella pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder of one of his victims, Larry Pearson. He died of a heart attack while incarcerated at the Missouri State Penitentiary in 1992. Terry Blair is an American serial killer who killed at least 7 women in Kansas City, Missouri, between 1982 and 2004. In 1982, Blair murdered the mother of his 2 children. She was pregnant at the time of her death. He was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment, and was released on parole after serving 21 years. In 2004, Blair was charged with 8 counts of murder. 2 counts were later dropped due to lack of evidence. A 911 call claimed responsibility for the murders. The caller stated that they were all prostitutes and scum, which is why they were killed. Blair's semen was found on at least one of his victims. Terry Blair was sentenced to 6 life sentences for the 6 murders in 2004. The Edgecombe County serial killer is an unidentified serial killer in the surroundings of Edgecombe and Halifax counties in North Carolina, United States. There are 10 suspected victims, all African American women, and the remains of 8 have been recovered. Because some of the victims had been found near the Seven Bridges Road in Rocky Mount, the culprit has also been called the Seven Bridges Killer. All the victims were black, engaged in prostitution and had problems with drug addiction at various times. Antoine Pittman has been convicted in 1 case. Despite the fact that he was never charged with the other murders, the media and police have identified him as responsible for them, since, according to the official version provided by law enforcement, the killing ceased after his arrest. Johannes Mashiane was a South African serial killer, known as the Beast of Atarajeveli. Mashiane committed 13 counts of murder and 12 counts of sodomy from 1982 to 1989. In 1977, Mashiane killed his girlfriend and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. He was released in 1982. Mashiane killed 12 boys by either strangling or stoning them between 1988 and 1989. In 1989, Mashiane committed suicide when he jumped under a bus in Marabastad while being chased by police. Mickey Pistorius notes, Mashiane had a tattoo of a cross and dagger on his left forearm. In his 2012 book Strangers on the Street, Serial Homicide in South Africa, 1 victim is known to have survived Mashiane's attention. Joachim George Kroll was a German serial killer, necrophile, and cannibal. Known as the Duisburg Man-Eater. In 1982, Kroll was convicted of 13 murders and 1 attempted murder. With an IQ of 76, borderline retarded, Kroll was considered the town idiot in Duisburg. Kroll had evidence including body parts in his fridge, a small hand that was cooking in a pan, and entrails found stuck in his toilet when police searched his apartment. He confessed saying that he often sliced portions of flesh from his victims to cook and eat, claiming that he did this to save on his grocery bill. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1982. In 1991, Joachim George Kroll died from a heart attack while in the prison of Rheinbach, Germany. April 25, 2013. A Phoenix woman accused of murdering and dismembering her mother has been sentenced to 22 years in prison. 42-year-old Carol Hadley was sentenced after entering into a plea agreement for second-degree murder. Phoenix police say 73-year-old Deborah Hadley was in the process of being dismembered at the home she shared with her daughter when officers arrived on the scene on July 30, 2012. They say Carol Hadley didn't confess to killing her mother, but claimed she was wrapping her in plastic bags in order to take her to a hospital. Officers reported finding large garbage bags that they believe she was planning to use to get rid of the body. Police say the mother and daughter had a tumultuous relationship, with a history of domestic incidents. In October 1949, Jean Lee, traveled to Melbourne with Robert Clayton, who had just been released from jail. They teamed up with another criminal, Norman Andrews. The three committed minor offenses. On November 8th, a 73-year-old, part-time bookmaker, William Kent, was found murdered in the front room of his house in Dorrit Street, Carlton. The police alleged that Clayton, Andrews, and Lee had accompanied Kent to his home, bashed and tortured him to find where he had hidden his money, and finally strangled him. Angry and bitter about the charge, Lee pleaded innocence, and insisted she was an onlooker. She was sentenced to death and executed by hanging at Pentridge Prison, Coburg, on February 19, 1951. Jean Lee was the last woman to be executed in Australia. Jarno Sebastianel is a Finnish devil worshipper who was sentenced to life in prison for murdering a 23-year-old man, eating some of the body parts, and instigating others to participate in a ritual that included torturing the victim and listening to black metal music. On November 21, 1998, in Hyvinkää, the criminal investigation started when a lake was found from a dump site, thus giving the name, dump site murder, to the case. The case was generally described as the most gruesome homicide in Finnish history. The Helsinki Court of Appeal granted Eld parole in December 2014. After the sentences, the media tried to raise up black metal music as a scapegoat for the happenings in Hyvinkää. The court declared most of the details of the case to be sealed for 40 years. Darren Dion Van is an American serial killer, also known as Donald Van. Van confessed to the murders of at least 7 women in Gary, Indiana, between 1995 and 2010. Van would rape and strangle victims prior to leaving their bodies in abandoned structures in Gary, Indiana. He was captured after police traced the missing cell phone of one of his victims, which Van still had in his possession. In 2018, Darren Dion Van was convicted on 7 counts of murder, and was sentenced to 7 concurrent life sentences. Thomas Hargrove, founder of the Murder Accountability Project, together with the Gary, Indiana deputy coroner, attempted to persuade police that there were 18 similar murders that Van was responsible for, but authorities denied any connection in the cases. More of a rampage killer than a mass murderer, Daniel Remeda killed 5 people over 6 days in February 1985. His first victim was the convenience store clerk, 60-year-old Marita. Within 6 days, he had gunned down Linda Marvin and Larry McFarland in Arkansas, and Glenn Moore and John R. Schroeder in Kansas. 3 more were wounded. The violence ended in a gun battle with police in an unoccupied farmhouse in Atwood, Kansas. Remeda was sentenced to life for the Kansas murders, and to death in both Arkansas and Florida. Remeda once said he wanted to be extradited to Florida, because it imposes capital punishment. I want them to pull the switch. I'm not afraid. Death is only as ugly as you make it. He was executed by electrocution in Florida on March 31, 1998. The Monash University shooting was a mass shooting in which a 36-year-old international student, Huan Yun Xiang, killed students William Wu and Stephen Chan, both 26, and injured 5 others, including the lecturer. It took place at Monash University, in Melbourne, Australia, on October 21, 2002. The gunman was acquitted of crimes related to the shootings, due to mental impairment, and is currently under psychiatric care. Several of the people present in the room of the shootings were officially commended for their bravery in tackling Xiang and ending the shooting. Huan Yun Xiang stabbed a staff member, who cannot be named, in the neck and hand, on October 20, 2016, at Thomas Embling Hospital, where he is receiving treatment.